There are important background considerations we need to look at before we delve into details about the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels. Unfortunately, these are factors that promoters of the Q and Markan priority hypotheses seldom or never take account of. You would think that before they theorized who copied who and why, a theorist might take a look at how exactly the processes of writing and copying took place. Unfortunately, much of the argumentation in this regard seems predicated on the proposition that someone like Matthew would take Mark to a place like this and do something like this. But that's not the case at all. When we realize how copying of written works was actually done in the 1st century, differences between texts in terms of order and content suddenly get prosaic explanations. The first point, as discussed in this series, is that the 1st century was an oral environment. Literacy in this day was between 5 and 10% depending on the location. However, even those who could read were affected by what is called a residual orality that colored their writing. This and the fact that the art of writing had yet to invent such visual cues as paragraphs, punctuation, and separation of letters into words meant that oral cues served a greater purpose, and documents could be rearranged in context to provide oral signposts, depending on a writer's purpose. Second, physical composition involving copying was limited by practical constraints. The theorists often talk about Matthew having a copy of Mark at his elbow while composing his own gospel. The truth is that Matthew could in no way have had a copy of Mark at his elbow to copy it. Critics have invoked such an image of Matthew, or whoever they suppose the writer of that gospel was, sitting at some desk while making feverish notes, glancing back and forth between his work and Mark's gospel. In fact, such a feat would be nearly an impossibility. As we mentioned in a series here long ago, there was no such thing as a writing desk in that time and place. Tables were available, but the idea to use them for writing had somehow not yet occurred to anyone. A copyist had to assume an unwieldy position on the floor or perhaps on a stool as he wrote, and they would have had to engage in some cumbersome acrobatics. So in fact, copying from another text would have been done some other way. Pliny the Elder described one method. He would have educated slaves read the text aloud from scrolls and then make notes on wax tablets. From these notes he would later reconstruct an account, incorporating the work of others as he did so. It is also probable that dependence on memory would be greater. Rather than feverishly copying and thus increasing the labor of his work, a scribe would read aloud and try to remember as much as possible, trusting his memory to keep the substance of the material in mind. One classical scholar put it this way: in all of this, we should note that constraints on composition like these don't refute the premises of Q and Markan priority, but they do break the stranglehold which supposes that there was no other likely way for the synoptics to have been composed. Once this is in mind, it's time to get down and dirty with some specific arguments for Q and Markan priority, and we'll start with a look at some arguments for the latter next time.